What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality, spirituality, spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality.
All right, this is Angelo John for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Diversity and Spirituality Network is an emerging community of people who are actively exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. Now, we all have different opinions as to what that looks like, but for me personally, I see sacred inclusion as nothing less than a sacred path in and of itself. I'd like to invite you to rate the podcast on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts, which goes a long way to helping us spread the word and to share our message of sacred inclusion. Today, I'm privileged to introduce and to interview Diana Goetsche, who's an American poet, a nonfiction writer, and columnist, whose honors includes fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, the New York Foundation of the Arts, and a Pushcart Prize. She's got quite a life experience, which includes 21 years of teaching in the New York City public schools. She founded the Jane Street Press, which is a unique zero-profit press dedicated to publishing undiscovered masters of American poetry. She's trained and performed as a concert jazz pianist and is an authorized meditation instructor in the Chiam Trungpa lineage. From 2015 and 16, she wrote the Life in Transition blog at the American Scholar, where she chronicled her gender transition, along with issues faced by America's newest visible minority. Quite an introduction, Diana. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Angelo.
You know, I'm going to start with my usual introductory question, which is to tell me a little bit about your religious or spiritual background.
Well, I'm a practicing Vajrayāna Buddhist. My practice these days is a tantric practice. I do something called Yidam practice, Vajrayogini practice. It involves energy, visualizations. There's a liturgy. There's a very rich lineage, and in the Tibetan system, you don't know things on the inside until you kind of see it on the outside, and then you kind of install it. So, like many Buddhist sanghas or Buddhist practices and sects, there's this view of perfection that we're already perfect. But in the Tibetan system, it's hard to look at it directly on the inside. So you build it on the outside, and then you kind of install the ship in the bottle, and you're always going in and out and in and out. And that's kind of the gate to the city for this kind of Buddhism. And I think every Buddhism has its own gate and its own style. And they're all good.
Well, I mean, I understand that you're a practicing Buddhist now, but you didn't start out that way as a child, did you?
My mother's side was Jewish. My father's side was Lutheran, and we were raised with no religion whatsoever. My brother became a born-again Christian, and I think that came out of a kind of an emptiness and trouble and desperation in his teens. And soon after in college, I majored in religion. So I think that's what happens when you leave a vacuum. Spirituality is just one of the basic ingredients of who we are, no matter what house you grow up in. And I always went east. When I studied, started meditating in college, and stayed with it really my whole life.
Now we're going to start talking about a lot of fairly interesting things, but I want to take advantage of the fact that you're a poet, and I wonder if you might read something. Okay,
well, now you mentioned poet, but you had asked me to read a piece of prose. I could read a poem or a piece of prose. I'm going to leave that up to you.
Oh boy. All right. Well, let's go with. You're going to leave it up to me. Let's go with prose.
Okay. So let me read one of these early columns from the Life in Transition blog at the American Scholar that you mentioned a few minutes ago. And this sort of combines my identity journey as a trans person with my spiritual journey. And, I go on spiritual retreat 2 or 3 times a year. And this was a particularly important retreat. And I'll just read it. It's called The Cabin. I came out to myself in February 2014 during a 12-day solo meditation retreat in a remote cabin at 8,000 feet in Colorado. The cabin had a wood stove, a bucket for a bathroom, and the luxury of a propane burner. There were water coolers and a faucet a quarter mile down the mountain. It was, in spiritual parlance, a very protected space, especially the loft upstairs overlooking the San Luis Valley, where I would practice many hours a day. But on day 1, I felt stuck, unable to engage in the tantric meditation I'd come there to practice. I tried to stay with it, and somewhere in the middle of the stuckness, I sensed that it would go better if I switched to a female body. So that's what I did. Now, that may sound crazy, but in tantric states, which involve energy and visualization, conventional logic falls away. There is no crazy or sane, no separation between inner self and outside phenomena. The instruction is to let whatever comes up have its life. So I shifted into a female aspect, and energy poured through me. I finished my morning practice and came downstairs for lunch, engaging in the familiar activities of cooking, eating, and napping, plus one other thing, freaking out over what the hell went on up there in that loft. Another meditation instruction is look again. Don't come to conclusions. Just come back and look again. That's what I did later that afternoon, again that evening, and the next morning. Each time I went upstairs and re-entered practice, I was female. Each time I came downstairs to check the fire or do chores or urinate, I was in shock. What did this mean? At night, unable to sleep, I allowed myself to imagine exactly this. What would it mean to live as a woman? In moments of bravery, and it may sound crazy to call an act of imagination brave, I visualized a life of presenting myself and being received by others as a woman. Words bubbled up from within. You mean I actually get to be me? That was euphoric. It was also terrifying.
That's really beautiful. I've read most of what I call the Diana letters. Perhaps you have another title for them. There's one particular passage that really stood out for me, and I wonder if you could elaborate on it. You talk about how fiercely the border between male and female is guarded. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and in fact, when I wrote that was a private letter I was writing to friends that I've since made public. It was a way of keeping my sanity while I was transitioning and before I was out. And when I wrote that letter, I likened it to the Jim Crow South, if I'm remembering correctly. And, in the South, and you do know this, I'm sure, in the South during Jim Crow, any white person outranked any black person and could invoke that in a heartbeat. A little boy could give orders to a stately older black gentleman, and the power was arranged that way, and any white person could kind of uphold this border and call people out, whether it was where they were in a bus or a train or in a bathroom or things like that. And there's a big parallel to what trans people go through. People just police, not all people, of course, but many, enough. They police the gender divide. And, if someone's crossing the line, they'll hold up a flag, they'll call them out, they'll ridicule. I mean, it could turn into violence. It could be just, some kind of curiosity, but it's not a peaceful curiosity. It's someone thinking they have the right to ask questions and interrogate somebody who's expressing themselves in a non-binary way. And I saw it happen, just before I wrote that letter with somebody I'd been acquainted with for a long time, and he noticed I had nail polish on, and he had to get to the bottom of it. We're at a party, and he's investigating. I mean, it's incredible, and it happens all the time.
Yeah, I think of my experience, and you could tell me if your experience is different, is that this is a little bit less of an issue with the younger generation. I'll call it. I've met more people that do not identify with a particular sexual identity that are younger. I don't see that among people in my generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the young people are way ahead, and I don't get misgendered by anybody under 40. I started to realize that. People under 40, they might ask you your pronoun, or you tell them who you are, or they just see. They see what you're wearing. They see how you're presenting. They hear that your name is Diana, and they're going to guess right, and unless they're corrected, and then they just get it, and they really do get it, and they see you as female. Older folks, people over 40, they mess up all the time, and there's lots of different reasons for it, but those are the only people I have issues with. They want to somehow, I don't know what they want, but they wind up, putting their definition onto you, if they themselves kind of aren't buying it with their eyes or their ears, and they just want to kind of have their view run the show. It's almost like a trans person is an ocular insult, and they need to reestablish what they think is normal.
Well, I would love for this to be an appropriate time for a poem. I'm not sure if there is one.
Well, I've actually written my most recent collection, which is the first one I wrote under a female byline, Diana Goetsche. I have 7 books of poems under the name Douglas Goetsche. But it involved, I mixed in a lot of poems about, so-called trans experience. I can read you the title poem, In America. This is based on a trans person who had all kinds of trouble with the TSA at an airport one time, and she actually posted this on Facebook Live, and it's quite dramatic. And this is a takeoff of it in a poem.
Please.
So I'll read this if you don't mind. In America. Why don't you go to Japan and ask the cats, I said to the TSA agent when she asked if I was Amish, because I believe in answering a non sequitur with a non sequitur. I only said it after I'd been cleared, after I'd been strip searched behind frosted glass, and then posted the bitch's face on Facebook along with her name. Maybe being trans is like being Amish, or maybe I went pale when I missed my flight as security agent Pamela E. Starks conferred with explosives expert Gary Pickering to discuss, based on the, quote, soft anomaly picked up by the body scanner, which of them needs to search me. At one point, she suggested they each take half. I suppose I could have come from Amish country, a place so deep in the heart of America it can't be seen, and delivered to the airport by horse and buggy, an Amish horse, oblivious to traffic. Maybe it's because of my long black dress or makeup that makes it look like I'm not wearing makeup, a goal whose purpose used to elude me, though I totally get it now, but please don't ask. You could go and ask the cats in Japan, though it's bound to earn you a contemptuous frown, by which they mean to say, eat my ass in Macy's window. How do cats in Japan know about Macy's, you must be asking? Beats the hell out of me. They have no tails. Did you know? Neither do the Amish. Just kidding. I'm still waiting to hear about the complaint I filed, the one that, along with the viral video of them repeatedly calling me it, shut down the TSA website for 3 days while they rewrote the rules about me. You could be charged for this, friends warn me. But in America, it can't be libel if it's true. I learned that from the cats in Japan, who you can ask, though it's best not to disturb them.
Now, I know you're riffing off of somebody else's experience, Diana, but you have experience of going through an airport and having to go through things with the TSA people?
I get body searched every time. Every single time I get body searched. It's humiliating. And you can't say anything till afterwards. I brought that into the poem. I wait until they're done, because if you say anything that makes you a suspect, they kind of go into Rambo mode and you'll miss your flight. But once they're done, I go into Rambo mode. I said, okay, why did you just do that? And they don't want to answer, but then I keep asking. And often they'll say, well, it was this tie, where you had this belt in your sweater or your knot in your sweater. And I said, your machine can't tell the difference between a bomb and a knot in a sweater? All I know is the pattern, and every single time I get body searched.
So, we started a little bit. You told me about your Buddhist practice, and so a supposition that some people might make is that Buddhists are a little bit more holier than thou, or because they practice a particular spiritual path, they've got it. They're accepting, et cetera, et cetera. But when we first met, you shared with me about how your sangha reacted to your transition, and it didn't conform to that stereotype I just said. Can you say a little bit more about what happened and what you learned from it?
Well, yeah, they had a lot of trouble with it, and I had a lot of trouble with them having trouble with it. I should say quickly, though, except for the people under 40, the younger people completely embraced me. Vast majority of people in the Sangha completely embraced me. It was they were huge allies, and it was a big help in adjusting and transitioning to have the support of so many of these people. But the older people, including the teacher and the leadership of the Sangha, they did not completely embrace me, and there was an enormous amount of transphobia, awkwardness, inappropriate things being said to me, and it never stopped. And even after 3.5 years, in fact, it started to snowball, and it kept getting worse. And I looked around and I noticed that this is a Sangha dripping with privilege. I mean, they meet in Colorado. They come from different places, but they have the means to meet in Colorado. It's a very educated group. It's extremely white. And there are queer people, but many of them distance themselves from the Sangha. And, I started to see the Sangha beneath the Sangha. And, I guess this is what it means to be most humans, to be a second-class citizen. And I was most certainly a second-class citizen instantly when I showed up.
Yeah, one of the pieces in there that you mentioned, it's a racial dynamic. I don't know whether you know this, but there's a lot going on there's various white people, females in this case, they have online retreats. And there's been a lot of back and forth because they culturally appropriate or they don't invite any people of color into their community of spiritual teachers that are presenting these kind of things. There's quite a lot of privilege that's going on that is it's sort of masked until something happens that reveals it.
Yeah. And there's no excuse for the kind of behavior you're describing, no excuse for it whatsoever. And it still goes on. And I have a lot of interest in that because, of course, when you're talking about any contemplative tradition, it's always about what you do off the cushion. Chogyam Trungpa, my root guru, calls it meditation in action. And it's always the post-meditative state, which is the rest of your life and how you behave and how do you treat people and how do you respond to situations. I mean, that is the proof in the pudding. Nobody cares if you're hot on the cushion, if you're a really great meditator, but how do you handle others? Are you saving sentient beings, which happens moment by moment? And a lot of folks can talk a good game, but, what happens, when you need to meet a situation and maybe you need to give some territory that you shouldn't even be occupying in the first place. Now let's see what happens now.
I know you also, one thing I wanted to, before I forget to ask you, you and I had a conversation. It was very interesting when we first met. And, it was about the first noble truth of Buddhism. And, you're much more of a practicing person than I am. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So just to review the conversation a little bit, it's like I've gotten a little bit impatient. I shouldn't say just a little bit. I've gotten impatient with a lot of so-called woke people because basically they put down other people that they don't see as woke, basically. And that seems to be the conversation. That made me think that, yes, according to the First Noble Truth, everybody is suffering. And in that, I attempt to include even the people of privilege. And there was a correction that you made for me, which is very illustrative, and I'd like to explore that a little bit. And basically, as I remember you expressing, you said, well, you have to bring into it the second noble truth. And rather than me just fumbling over words here, could you say a little bit more about that and how that relates to, this piece about privilege and power?
Yeah, I've become a big fan of the second noble truth recently. I mean, they're all four good, and of course they're noble. But second noble truth is it's variously translated, but I'll just say seeing into the causes of suffering. And, the causes of suffering of a king could be very different from the causes of suffering of a peasant. And we shouldn't assume that the second noble truth is the same for every person. And, a lot of this was brought home to me by a Zen priest named Zenju Earthlyn Manuel, who wrote a book called The Way of Tenderness. And she looks at Black people, she looks at trans people and queer people, and she looks at bodies. And, you have a non-standard body, which means you are in a minority. And you're treated this way because of your body, as opposed to the content of your character, as Dr. King reminds us. And so, just to take a simple example, maybe a person has a hard day at work because their boss is a real idiot and is incredibly mean and mistreats them. And they come home and, they're just neck deep in suffering. When is this bullying going to stop? And, your heart goes out to these people. It's suffering. But compare that to the person of color whose application got thrown out as soon as this boss recognized, let's just say, an African-American name. And they weren't even considered for the job. And then you take a look at unemployment in cities, and then you take a look at other things that happen with unemployment, crime, drugs, what have you. And the person who doesn't even have a chance at the opportunity to suffer like the other person who got the job, that is a different magnitude of suffering. And it's unhelpful to pretend that all suffering is created equal. It's not. And this makes privileged people deeply uncomfortable.
Diana, this sounds like a good interlude for a poem. I don't know where we're going to go with there, but it's your au revoir.
But would you like me to read Black People Can't Swim?
Sure, but say a little bit about the poem first of all.
Okay, Black People Can't Swim. It's a provocative title, but it's a quote from my friend Patricia Smith, who's a wonderful poet and who is Black, and she said it in the poem. And this little setup is sort of the point of the poem, is what different people are and aren't allowed to say, and the situationality of both joy, suffering, and freedom. And so, yeah, it's always about situations. And let me see if I can get it up on my computer, because I don't have the collection where it is handy, but I have it. Anyhow, this is the poem that garnered the Pushcart Prize that you mentioned.
And this is one of the relatively few poems that you will read by a white person about race, at least in my experience.
Yeah, there are very few white poets that will write about, and I'm white, but there are very few white poets that will write about race. Okay, I think it's from Nameless Boy. It is. Black People Can't Swim. When I told Patricia how much I loved the pool at the Y, she said, "Oh, black people can't swim," which made me grateful to be let in on this. Not the information, but the intimacy, the fact that she could let fly with such a piece of black on black attitude without the slightest bit of shame or self-consciousness. We were in a bar, me and 5 black women who were paying more attention than any white females I'd ever seen to a football game on TV. The injured halfback in elegant street clothes, towering above the sideline reporter, caused each woman to suck her teeth. That is one fine brother. Best thing I'll never have sex with. The lips are a little big, but homeboy's still pretty. Why wouldn't you have sex with him, I asked. 'Cause he a hoe, Hallie said. Everyone in the NFL's a hoe. Cheryl and EJ chimed in. I looked up at the TV again, and this player, whose name I'd known, now seemed changed into someone both simpler and deeper. We were all toddlers when Martin dreamed of little black children and little white children going to school arm in arm. He dreamed this too, a restaurant table where we were free to reveal not just our true, but our mysterious, irrational selves in the presence of the other tribe without apology. So here was Kaiesia, who had given us all a lecture on how not to pronounce her name, and who held my arm all meal, saying I was her husband. This is back in my Doug days. Held my arm all meal, saying I was her husband. What was that? They asked when she left. A mystery. Earlier, on the walk over, she pulled me away from the group into a leather shop to show me a $200 Italian bag on layaway. And what did you say? Nice bag? That's not what she wanted to hear. which was they eyed each other, deciding who would tell. Honey, when a sister shows a man something on layaway, she wants him to buy it. No way. But they were all nodding, and I had to love this country, or this 10 square feet of it, where they could tell me about men and women and race and layaway. And I could have told them about all the black people who swim at the Y, though maybe they already knew, and just delighted in saying with impunity what the vice president of the Los Angeles Dodgers blurted out on national TV. They don't have the buoyancy, Al Campanis told Ted Koppel, then promptly lost his job, and rightfully so.
You know what I love about that poem, Diana, is that it speaks to the possibility of shared intimacy between different groups. It actually reminds me of an exploration we did a couple of years ago in the Diversity and Spirituality Network called The Things We Don't Tell One Another. And the premise is that we all have secrets in our groups that we don't easily share with others. And if it's done if it's done from a place of trust, the sharing of these secrets or sharing of inside information, it can create a context of deeper mutual understanding.
I mean, I think the reason why sharing that inside information is so rare and such an act of trust is because if you make that too public, if Patricia said to me in the restaurant privately what she says, if she said it more publicly, it could be used as a wedge. But I think the difference is in one case it's weaponized, and in another case, nothing's a weapon when there's an intimate moment and it's a trust. And so we're back to how the context is so important. And if you wanted to take, coming back to, let's say, a Buddhist Sangha and integrate it, you'd have to put bodies in a context in a way that they can gradually relax and have that kind of intimacy, but it's not going to happen unless you make it happen. Well, it can't be assumed anyway over the course of a group. There are some people who get it. They get it right away. They get me and they get you, and they're not going to make assumptions. And I actually think these people actually have allies' bodies. I think there's a racist body, and literally a body, somatically uncomfortable in the presence of a non-standard body, a black person, a gay person, a trans person. And then there are other people who seem to have bodies that get it. They're actually quite relaxed. Even if they're ignorant, they're ready to learn, and they're actually fine.
Now, to segue just a little bit, I remember you talked about being on retreat with other trans folk. And before you were talking about a situation with a Sangha that was not so comfortable. So I'm wondering how that was different. What was it like to create community or be among community among other trans folk?
Yeah, and this also was a recommendation of that author I mentioned before, the Zen priest named Earthlyn Zenju Manuel. She talks about in her book sanctuary retreats, and that inspired me. And one of the functions of Sangha, which means community, is the same as, really what your friends do for you at times. They call you on your shit, they reflect back, and, they mirror you. And you might see yourself in the mirror covered in slime, but don't blame the mirror. You should trust the mirror. But when a minority, an oppressed minority, is in a bad Sangha, and there's privilege going on, and people are blind, that mirror is not reliable. They don't know if they're being checked in a way that's healthy or not. It's hard to know. Well, sometimes they do know, and sometimes it's not healthy. But oftentimes it's just hard to know if this person giving you this feedback is trustworthy if the situation doesn't feel trustworthy. And yet you need that feedback. Chogyam Trungpa said the job of the teacher is to insult the student's ego, which is very different from trying to destroy a person. And it's the same with the Sangha. A good Sangha will give you the feedback you need. And, sometimes we learn the most from difficult things being told to us. Well, when you're among people who are like you, and it's not perfect, but I ran a retreat for queer and trans people in Gainesville, Florida, and there were 10 of us in a circle. And the feedback was fantastic. And it wasn't always easy. People knew each other in the community, and we didn't have anyone looking or weaponizing something we might say to each other in shorthand or kidding around. We could actually let down our guard and receive the feedback, the positive mirroring without fetishizing, and the negative mirroring without destroying. And there wasn't that, I'll just use the Buddhist word, there wasn't the obscuration of worrying about if the mirror was trustworthy. The mirror was extremely trustworthy, and we started shining the mirror more and more the longer the weekend went on.
I have my equivalent things, being a black person, being a retreat with other black people versus more interracial situation. Yeah, well, gosh, no, I'm not. That's another conversation.
But it's the same thing, though, right? If you go to Burning Man, and let's say it's a version of Burning, I've never gone to Burning Man, but let's say it's not very diverse. You've got a lot more stress, or at least there's a lot more to the situation of you being there than, a cisgender straight white person being there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to your point that you mentioned, sometimes you don't know whether what's happening in the mirror is coming from inside of you or from outside of you. It's just hard to make that discernment. So, even though your Sangha mates in this old experience hopefully treated you badly, you're still a Buddhist. Yeah. You practice pretty devoutly. Yeah. I wonder if you could share a little bit about how your practice has served to ground you through what I imagine might have been the very intense experience of transition.
Yeah, in a way, I owe it all to this teacher who turned out to be a fairly bigoted individual, unfortunately, and yet he trained me. And the way he trained me was, frankly, fantastic in terms of the practices themselves. In the Dharma, at least in the Vajrayāna system, what you learn is not actually a process of acquisition. It's more of a process of dismantling and shedding a series of masks, of trips, of veils, false selves. The ego itself is said to be this, this construction, this mask, this artificial thing, and the training was amazing, and there were a series of vows and a series of dedications and rededications, each one more severe, and there's a lot of good training there. And so what I was doing, when I look back on it, was shedding all the kinds of things that were in between me and that moment in the cabin where I realized, holy shit, I'm trans, and I've been this way my whole life, and I've had all of these things stripped away. At that point, I had been, doing the nundro, which is this, these accumulated crazy things you do, 108 repetitions of a mantra, or a full prostration, other kinds of things. And there's several of these, very, very thorough, very extensive, and yet all of these are called preliminaries. That's how thorough this stuff is. And I was on the final preliminary, which took years. And the final one, there's 1,000,000 repetitions of a guru yoga formula. And it doesn't even matter what it means. You're saying it in Sanskrit. Not that it doesn't completely matter, but what a mantra does is energetic. And what this mantra was doing for me in that protected space on the mountain was enabling me to look at what's still me when I've gotten rid of a lot of different things that I've been holding. And that's when I saw in a very inescapable way, the fact that I'm trans and I have to do this. So I really owe it all, frankly, to this bigoted teacher. How strange is that?
Well, I mean, I think actually it's kind of a tribute to you. In other words, nobody's perfect, and to be able to learn from somebody who is bigoted or has issues, I mean, I think that's a good thing.
Had I known his true colors the whole time, though, it might not have gone that way. I mean, it only came out when I came back to a program as Diana, and they were so scared.
Right.
I said to him directly. I mean, frankly, what happened was he told me privately in a conversation he wanted to have before the program began that he considered me a threat to the container. And I mean, this is the ultimate scapegoating. Without a trans person, then there's no gender issue, I guess. And I screamed at him. And in the middle of screaming at him, I told him, "You made me this way. You've made me strong enough to basically, tell you to go fuck yourself." And so I was giving him, frankly, love and credit as I was yelling at him for scapegoating me, then and there. So there's the training for you.
Well, I guess it was good training.
Yeah. Here we are, the peaceful Buddhists. Which is a big stereotype anyway, but that's okay.
So in a minute, I'm going to ask you to close it out with a poem. But first, I want to just follow up with, what do you do these days to keep yourself grounded? What is your practice, to put it simply? Because I imagine you could probably go on at some length. But what do you do each day as far as spiritual practice goes?
Well, okay. So after the preliminaries, which take forever, in my lineage, you go through what's called abhisheka, which is another word for anointing or crowning or sprinkling. It's got different translations, but basically you go through a ceremony that kind of inaugurates into your life the full power of the higher tantric practices. And one of the most popular practices is what I do, which is called yidam practice, where basically there is a vision of perfection you relate with. It is kind of human in shape. My yidam is called Vajrayāna, and there's a very extensive, beautiful, and kind of flickering and changeable. It's different every time, but there is a ceremony that you do called sadhana, and it's a ceremony, daily ceremony, frankly, for relating with this vision of perfection, and you just kind of do it. It's very elaborate, but because it's so elaborate, you can slip the noose of the thinking mind. It's kind of, the thinking mind is kind of doing its thing and doing the ceremony, but then something else very powerfully is going on that connects you to the texture of reality at any given moment, which is the point of any spirituality. It's to be in proper connection with reality. So I do what's called Vajrayāna practice, and that's my main. I do other things as well, and I also, am a meditation instructor. So I'll do, all kinds of different practices with my students, and they're still very fruitional for me as well.
So, do you have a poem that you think would be appropriate for us to close this out with?
I have a poem here called One Taste. Maybe it'd be appropriate since we're talking about spirituality. One Taste is one of several outrageous concepts in Vajrayāna Buddhism. Vajrayāna and Tantra mean the same thing. Tantra means thread, Vajrayāna means indestructible jewel, but they're both the higher path of Buddhism. And One Taste is a teaching which tells us that every single experience basically is the same stuff. It's all the universe expressing its love for you. But try telling that to someone as they tear up their ticket at Belmont when they're next to someone else jumping for joy with the winning ticket at Belmont. They don't want to hear about your theory of one taste, let alone someone with a cancer diagnosis, and et cetera. So that's why I say it's outrageous, the idea that all luck is just luck. And so one day, recently, I wrote a poem called One Taste. Morning wake up, what Wilbur, this is the poet Richard Wilbur, what Wilbur called the punctual rape of every blessed day, could just as easily be great sex, depending on the day, the bed, the personnel, or just your attitude, which might explain why those in wheelchairs complain less than those who walk, leading us to conclude, what the fuck? One taste, Buddhists say, no difference between good and bad luck, or just good and bad, despite all we might want to know about the wine, the relief pitcher, the diagnostic radiologist, or our next lover. What if you could get with Beyonce? I once asked some boys in a jail, but then found out she smelled. I was trying to teach creative writing, the power of the senses. Fuck no, some said, though others weren't so sure, while one just mouthed her name dreamily. For real? Beyonce smells? He asked, as if I knew, as if everyone on the outside knew everyone else. I didn't even say bad or good, just that she smelled. Fuck no, said a kid who'd already said fuck no, smiling at his power to send away Beyonce. Sometimes in that jail, there was pure joy. Not often, not enough. So thank God for tears. Thank God for sleep, and the tears in the sleep, and the joy in the tears.
Well, that's quite nice. That's quite powerful.
Yeah, I think that's more of the Buddhist equanimity that people think about, just the effort to step back and, appreciate the compassion and the sadness and the First Noble Truth of suffering at the same time, to also appreciate joy in some pretty tough places. This is the world.
So, Diana, I wanted to thank you for being my guest. If there's any, I have your website, obviously. Is there anything else you would like to promote or have people know about you, or where to find you, or just anything at all I can put in the show notes.
Yeah, myname.com is the website. If people are interested in studying with me in terms of writing, or even if they're in the New York area and they want to sit and meditate with me, you can contact me through the website. There's a whole coaching thing. But yeah, I'm a freelance writing teacher, and I just cobble together my living. And every now and then I run into someone like you who it's been very joyful and really a pleasure to talk to. We ran into each other in this cafe and we just started talking, and I'm really happy to continue the conversation with you.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity?